The year was 1941, and across the Pacific the tides of empire were shifting with the slow inevitability of fate. Japan, modern, disciplined, and burning with ambition, had carved a bloody path across China, yet its military machine was running dry. Oil, the lifeblood of war, had become scarce. When the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands imposed an embargo, the Japanese Empire found itself cornered. In Tokyo's war rooms, the whispers of survival turned into the cries of conquest. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, held the answer, a treasure trove of oil, tin, rubber, and bauxite, buried beneath tropical soil and guarded by an overstretched colonial army. Across the sea, in the humid port cities of Batavia and Surabaya, the Dutch colonial forces sensed something coming. The air carried unease, the kind that made even the cicadas pause between their songs. Allied officers from Britain and Australia came and went. Maps were unrolled under dim light, and cigarette smoke curled over uncertain faces. They knew the Japanese would strike, they just didn't know when or where. On December 7, 1941, the answer came in the roar of engines over Pearl Harbor. The world plunged into total war. Within hours, Japanese bombers struck the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Malaya. In less than a month, the empire of the rising sun stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, sweeping aside defenses that had taken decades to build. The Dutch East Indies now stood exposed, a prize too rich to ignore. Tokyo's orders were clear: secure the oil fields at Tarakan, Balikpapan, and Palembang. Without them, Japan's fleets would wither. With them, they could rule the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned that Japan had 6 months to run wild before American might caught up. Every day mattered. Every drop of oil was life or death. By early January 1942, the invasion was set in motion. Japanese convoys, protected by sleek destroyers and aircraft carriers, cut through the South China Sea like blades. They moved with machine precision, each vessel part of a grand, terrible choreography of empire. Above them, the sun glared through the mist, glinting off steel hulls. The world beneath was changing forever. Meanwhile, on the islands, the Dutch prepared for the inevitable. The KNIL, the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, was small, undertrained, and equipped with aging weapons from an empire already under occupation in Europe. The Dutch homeland had fallen to Nazi Germany in 1940, and what remained in Asia was a colony fighting in exile. Yet they stood with courage. Dutch officers, Indonesian soldiers, British airmen, and a handful of Australian reinforcements, united under the desperate hope that perhaps, somehow, they could slow the tide. On Tarakan Island, off Borneo's northeast coast, the first battle began. The island's oil fields made it a prime target, and its defenders, numbering barely 1,500, faced an invasion force 5 times their size. On January 11, 1942, Japanese troops landed under cover of darkness. The night exploded in the stutter of machine gun fire and the hiss of burning oil. The defenders fought fiercely, detonating their own wells before surrendering. Black smoke towered into the tropical sky, a funeral pyre for a vanishing empire. Further south, at Balikpapan, the Dutch prepared a grim repetition. Engineers wired the oil installations with explosives, determined to deny the enemy their prize. When the Japanese arrived, the coastline erupted in fire. The sky turned orange, and thick smoke blanketed the sea. Dutch patrol boats charged the Japanese convoy in suicidal defiance, their crews knowing full well they would not return. One by one, they were torn apart by shell fire. Yet the delay they caused would be remembered, a fleeting moment of resistance in a war already lost. The Japanese advance was relentless. City by city, island by island, they struck with overwhelming force. In the jungles, the air was heavy with the smell of rot, oil, and fear. Dutch and Indonesian soldiers fell back through rivers and swamps, their boots sinking in mud that seemed to pull them down into history itself. Civilians fled inland, carrying what they could. Villages burned behind them, the flames reflected in their eyes. In Tokyo, the military high command celebrated victory after victory. The newspapers called it the Southern Advance. To the generals, it was destiny. To the conquered, it was annihilation. By February, the Japanese flag flew over most of Borneo and Celebes. Next came Java, the heart of the Dutch East Indies, the seat of colonial power, and the last hope for Allied defence in the region. The Dutch Governor-General, Hubertus van Mook, radioed London and Washington for aid. The reply was sympathetic, but the truth was clear. Britain was fighting for its life in Burma and Singapore. The Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The Netherlands East Indies would stand alone. In the harbors of Surabaya and Cilacap, Allied ships gathered for what would become one of the last naval stands in the region, the American-British-Dutch-Australian Command, known as ABDACOM. Its officers, weary and outnumbered, stared at the horizon where the Japanese fleet was said to be forming. Their ships were old, their fuel was low, their air cover was almost non-existent. Yet still they prepared to fight. As night fell over Java, the tropical air grew thick with the hum of insects and distant thunder. Somewhere beyond the dark sea, engines murmured, a whisper of the coming storm. For those who waited, the hours stretched like eternity. The invasion had begun, and the Dutch East Indies, once a glittering jewel of empire, now braced for its final reckoning. The dawn that broke over Java on February 27, 1942, was no dawn of peace. The rising sun, symbol of the Japanese Empire, glared blood-red through the humid haze. Across the Java Sea, the rumble of engines rolled like distant thunder. The invasion fleet was coming. Hundreds of transports, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, advanced with mechanical precision, slicing through the waters toward the heart of the Dutch East Indies. Above them, squadrons of Mitsubishi Zero fighters carved white scars through the sky. Below, sailors gripped their posts, eyes fixed on the horizon where fire would soon meet steel. In Surabaya's harbor, the Allied fleet gathered for what was to become a desperate stand. The American-British-Dutch-Australian Command, ABDA, had cobbled together an armada from 4 nations: Dutch cruisers, De Ruyter and Java, British Exeter, Australian Perth, and American destroyers like John D. Edwards and Alden. They came under the command of Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, a man who understood the odds and yet refused to yield. His orders were simple and fatal: intercept the Japanese convoy, prevent the invasion of Java, hold the line at all costs. The men aboard these ships knew what that meant. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and facing a navy that had never known defeat. The Japanese fleet under Admiral Takagi Takeo had the advantage in every way: superior ships, longer-range guns, and aircraft that ruled the skies. Still, as the Allied fleet left Surabaya, a cheer rose from the decks. The time for waiting was over. At 4 p.m. the first salvos of the Battle of the Java Sea thundered across the water. Shells screamed through the air, trailing smoke and fire. Explosions shattered the surface, sending geysers of seawater skyward. On the bridge of De Ruyter, Admiral Doorman watched the horizon burn and gave the only order that mattered: engage the enemy. For hours, the sea became a cauldron. Dutch and British gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, the decks slick with oil and blood. The Japanese, moving with precise coordination, unleashed devastating torpedo attacks. The Exeter, a veteran of earlier battles, was struck amidships. Fire roared through her compartments. Sailors scrambled to save their wounded comrades as the ship listed, flames licking the sky. Nearby, the destroyer Kortenaya took a direct hit from a long-lance torpedo, breaking in 2. She vanished beneath the waves within minutes, taking nearly all hands with her. Night fell, but the battle did not end. The sea glimmered faintly under a crescent moon, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the faces of exhausted men. They fought on instinct now, no longer for victory, but for survival. Radio communication failed. Ammunition ran low. Ships scattered in the darkness, their silhouettes framed against burning oil slicks. Somewhere amid the chaos, Admiral Doorman's voice crackled through the radio. "Ik val aan, volg mij! I am attacking, follow me!" It would be his last transmission. Shortly before midnight, De Ruyter and Java were both struck by torpedoes from Japanese cruisers. The explosions tore through their hulls, setting the sea ablaze. Dorman refused to abandon ship until every man who could be saved had been evacuated. When De Ruyter sank, she took her admiral with her, along with more than 300 men. The survivors drifted through flaming debris, clinging to planks and wreckage as dawn crept across a sea of oil and death. The Java Sea was lost, the Allied fleet was shattered. Of the ships that had sailed from Surabaya, only a handful made it back. Those who did carried with them stories of heroism and futility, the last stand of men who fought in the face of hopeless odds. For the Dutch East Indies, the fall of Java was now only a matter of time. As the naval battle faded, the skies above Sumatra and Java filled with the whine of engines. Japanese bombers swept over Palembang, the empire's largest oil refinery. Below, Dutch engineers scrambled to ignite demolition charges. Black smoke billowed as the oil fields went up in flames, an inferno that turned the rivers into flowing fire. The Japanese 2nd Parachute Regiment descended through the smoke-like shadows, their silk canopies glowing orange from the blaze beneath. The Dutch defenders fought with rifles and machine guns until their ammunition ran dry. Palembang fell within days, its precious refineries captured mostly intact despite the desperate sabotage. For the Japanese, victory was not just a conquest, it was survival. Tankers soon began pumping oil back to the homeland, fueling the war machine that would strike across the Pacific. For the Allies, the loss was catastrophic. Without Java and Sumatra, their defensive line in Southeast Asia crumbled. Singapore had already fallen on February 15, 1942, and now the final barrier between Japan and the Indian Ocean was gone. On the ground, the human cost grew unbearable. In the city of Batavia, Dutch soldiers withdrew street by street, exchanging gunfire with advancing Japanese troops. Civilians huddled in basements as artillery shells shattered windows and walls. The smell of cordite and burning wood filled the air. On the outskirts, Indonesian civilians watched from rice fields as columns of smoke rose into the sky. Some saw the Japanese as liberators from colonial rule. Others saw only another master, replacing the old. In the final days of February, the remnants of Allied air units, American P-40s and Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, rose from crumbling airfields to meet the enemy. Their numbers were pitifully small, their planes outdated, their fuel nearly gone. Yet they fought with a kind of grim defiance that burned brighter than the fires below. Over Kalijati, Dutch pilots engaged Japanese bombers in swirling dogfights, the sky a deadly ballet of smoke trails and gunfire. One by one they fell, shot down, captured or forced to crash land in the jungle. By March 1st, Japanese forces landed in multiple locations across Java, Bantam Bay in the west, Kragen in the east. Their troops advanced swiftly, overwhelming the remaining defenders. Dutch soldiers, many of them colonial recruits from Indonesia, fought stubbornly but were cut off and surrounded. Communication lines collapsed. The radio at Allied headquarters crackled with fragments of doomed messages, coordinates, cries for air support. Then silence. Governor-General Van Mook and his staff relocated inland to Bandung, the final Allied stronghold. There, on March 8th, with Japanese troops encircling the city, the Dutch commander General Ter Poorten accepted the inevitable. He signed the formal surrender of all Allied forces in the Dutch East Indies. For the first time in over 3 centuries, Dutch rule in Indonesia ended, not by rebellion or diplomacy, but by the sword. The victors marched through the streets of Bandung under a blazing sun. Civilians lined the roads in silence as Japanese banners unfurled from government buildings. The rising sun flag fluttered above colonial mansions, once reserved for European elites. To some Indonesians, it symbolized freedom from Dutch oppression. To others, it marked the beginning of a darker occupation, one that would bring years of hardship, forced labor, and famine. Prisoners of war, Dutch, British, Australian, and American, were herded into makeshift camps. Many would be shipped to Burma, Borneo, or even Japan, to work as slaves for the empire they had tried to resist. Disease and starvation would claim thousands before the war's end. The tropical paradise, once called the Emerald of the East, had become a prison of its own making. Back in Tokyo, Japanese newspapers hailed the conquest as divine proof of the emperor's destiny. The oil of the Indies flowed north, powering ships and planes that would soon strike toward the Coral Sea and Midway. Yet, in the ashes of Java and Sumatra, the seeds of something unexpected had begun to stir. The collapse of colonial rule had opened a void, one that would awaken nationalist movements and set the stage for a new struggle, not between empires, but between occupiers and the occupied. For now, though, the fires still burned. Villages smouldered under the weight of war. The once proud Dutch East Indies lay silent beneath the rising sun. The world had changed forever, and those who survived could only whisper the same question that echoed across every battlefield of 1942: when will it end? The Empire of Japan now stood triumphant across the Pacific. From the Philippines to Singapore, from Borneo to Java, its flag rose over territories that had once belonged to Western powers. Yet beneath the surface of victory, the soil trembled with unease. The war was far from over. In the jungles, mountains, and seas of the Dutch East Indies, a new battle began, not for conquest, but for survival. It was March 1942. The rains came heavy that year, drenching the islands in a grey, endless curtain. Rivers swelled, roads turned to swamps, and the air hung thick with the smell of wet earth and oil. Across the newly conquered territories, Japanese patrols marched through mud and vines, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes sharp for any sign of resistance. They expected obedience. What they found instead was defiance, quiet, scattered, and stubborn as the roots of the jungle itself. In the mountains of Sumatra, Dutch officers who refused to surrender had fled into the highlands, gathering with local militias and villagers. They were out of contact, cut off from supplies, and hunted relentlessly. Yet they fought on, ambushing convoys, sabotaging airfields, and striking from the shadows. Among them were Indonesian soldiers who had once served under the colonial flag, but now fought for a cause of their own, the dream of an independent Indonesia, free from any foreign master, Dutch or Japanese. The Japanese occupation that followed the lightning conquest was brutal. In Batavia, now renamed Jakarta, the new military administration imposed order through fear. Curfews, forced labor, and public executions became part of daily life. Thousands of Indonesians were conscripted as romusha, laborers sent to build airfields, roads, and railways for the Japanese war machine. Many would never return. Disease spread through the camps. Malaria, dysentery, and starvation claimed lives faster than bullets ever could. For the surviving Allied prisoners, captivity was a slow descent into hell. Dutch and Australian soldiers captured on Java were crammed into bamboo barracks, guarded by men who saw them as less than human. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. At night, mosquitoes swarmed through torn nets, feeding on weakened bodies. Men who had once commanded ships and airfields now fought over bowls of rice, trading fragments of bread for a sip of water. Yet amid the suffering, there was dignity. They shared stolen cigarettes, whispered prayers, and carved the names of their fallen comrades into the wooden walls, determined that someone, somewhere, would remember them. To the north, the Allied command regrouped in Australia. The fall of the Dutch East Indies had cut the Pacific in half. The Japanese now possessed oil and resources enough to fuel their war for years. But Admiral Yamamoto knew what was coming. America was rising, its factories roaring back to life, its carriers prowling the Pacific. The tide, though distant, had already begun to turn. On the islands, whispers of resistance spread like wildfire. Radio operators hidden in the jungle tuned into faint Allied broadcasts from Darwin and Colombo, passing coded messages to submarines that prowled the Java Sea by night. Supplies were a trickle: medicine, ammunition, sometimes food, but each delivery brought hope. The war was no longer a fight for victory. It was a fight to endure long enough for rescue to come. In 1943, the Pacific erupted again. The Battle of the Coral Sea, then Midway, shifted the balance of power. Japan's unstoppable momentum began to falter. As the Allies advanced across the ocean, the Dutch East Indies, once a conquered jewel, became a fortress of retreat. The Japanese military tightened its grip, fearing invasion. Entire villages were relocated, suspected rebels executed without trial, and food seized for the army. Famine began to stalk the countryside. In Java, the people learned to hide their hunger behind silence. Markets emptied, rice harvests vanished into Japanese warehouses, and mothers boiled leaves to feed their children. At night, distant thunder was often mistaken for the sound of bombers, and sometimes it was. By 1944, Allied aircraft returned to the skies of the Indies. American B-24 Liberators and Australian bombers streaked across the clouds, their engines droning like a promise of vengeance. They targeted oil refineries, airfields, and shipping routes, the very arteries that had sustained Japan's conquest. The bombing of Balikpapan was among the most devastating. Flames soared hundreds of feet high, black smoke blotting out the sun. From the ground, Indonesians watched in awe and terror, torn between the joy of seeing their occupiers burn and the horror of their own land reduced to ash. For the Japanese soldiers, the once glorious campaign had turned into a nightmare of attrition. Supply lines were stretched thin, morale sank, and disease consumed whole garrisons. Some units, isolated on remote islands, went months without contact from headquarters. They lived off the land, growing thinner each week, haunted by the ghosts of the war they had once thought already won. In the mountains of Sulawesi, small Allied reconnaissance teams, Dutch and Australian commandos, slipped ashore under the cover of darkness. They trained local fighters, sabotaged fuel depots, and rescued stranded airmen. Their operations were deadly and brief. Many never returned, but their missions lit sparks of rebellion across the archipelago. The Japanese responded with brutality. Entire villages burned in reprisal, yet resistance only grew stronger. By late 1944, the war's momentum had turned. The Allies landed in the Philippines, reclaiming ground inch by inch. The once invincible Japanese Navy was shattered at Leyte Gulf. In Tokyo, optimism curdled into desperation. The emperor's ministers clung to illusions of negotiation, while his generals prepared to die for honor. In the Dutch East Indies, that meant even harsher control. The Japanese requisitioned everything: food, metal, livestock, and executed anyone suspected of aiding the enemy. And still, the jungle kept its secrets. Hidden beneath thick canopies and flooded valleys, the resistance endured. Dutch officers with rusted revolvers, Indonesian fighters with stolen rifles, and villagers armed with machetes all shared one goal: to outlast the empire that had enslaved them. Amid this chaos, a quiet transformation took root. For centuries, Indonesia had lived under Dutch rule, divided by islands, languages, and classes. But under Japanese occupation, a new sense of unity emerged, not under the rising sun, but under the shared suffering of war. The Japanese had promised Asia for Asians, yet their cruelty betrayed the lie. In the shadows of oppression, the idea of independence became a flame that no conqueror could extinguish. When news reached the Indies in mid-1945 that Japan's defenses were collapsing, it felt like hearing thunder before the storm breaks. American forces were closing in on Borneo, capturing Balikpapan after weeks of brutal fighting. Oil fields once again burned, this time to deny Japan's retreat. The air was filled with the sound of engines, the sea with the silhouettes of Allied fleets drawing ever closer. For the prisoners in the camps, the signs were unmistakable. Guards grew nervous, food rations disappeared, orders from Tokyo stopped coming. Some camps were abandoned entirely, others became sites of massacre, as the Japanese sought to erase evidence of their crime. Yet even as death hovered over them, the prisoners whispered one phrase over and over: "It's ending." In the final weeks of the war, hope returned like a ghost long thought dead. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, 2 atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, shattering not just cities, but the illusion of empire itself. The Japanese High Command, facing annihilation, surrendered on August 15th. Across the Pacific, bells rang and tears fell. But in the Dutch East Indies, the surrender did not bring peace. It brought chaos. When Japanese officers gathered their men and announced the emperor's decision, there was silence. Some soldiers broke down, others refused to believe it. For years they had fought, starved, and killed in the name of glory. Now the empire, for which they had sacrificed everything, was gone. In the villages, people emerged from hiding. Flags appeared, some Dutch, others bearing new symbols of red and white. The air was thick with uncertainty. The occupiers were leaving, but the colonizers were returning. Between them stood a people who had suffered too much to bow again. The struggle for survival had not ended with surrender. It had only changed shape. Out of the ashes of war, Indonesia's revolution was about to ignite. But that story would come later. For now, the world watched the islands fall silent, the guns still warm, the seas still stained, and the survivors still haunted by what they had seen. The Dutch East Indies had been the empire's greatest prize and its cruelest lesson. The Japanese came for oil and left behind a nation on the brink of rebirth. In the smouldering ruins of refineries and the graves of the fallen, history whispered its verdict. No empire lasts forever. August 1945. The guns had fallen silent, yet the echoes of war still haunted every island of the Dutch East Indies. Smoke hung over the jungles where once stood oil fields, towns, and garrisons. Rivers ran black with ash. The empire Japan had carved with fire and steel was collapsing piece by piece under the unbearable weight of its own ambition. For millions who had lived through the occupation, the end was not a moment of triumph. It was a void filled with grief, hunger, and uncertainty. The Japanese surrender reached the Indies like a whisper traveling across water. In the camps, emaciated prisoners stared at their guards, unsure whether to believe the rumors. In the villages, word spread that the emperor himself had spoken on the radio, telling his people to lay down their arms. For 3.5 years, the rising sun had burned across Southeast Asia. Now, for the first time, its light was fading. But with its fall came a question that no army could answer. Who would rule these islands now? In Batavia, the streets filled with people emerging from years of fear. Some carried banners of red and white, the old colors of Majapahit, the ancient Javanese kingdom that once ruled these islands. On August 17, 1945, just 2 days after Japan's surrender, a thin, bespectacled man named Sukarno stood before a crowd in Jakarta and declared Indonesia's independence. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of history. Around him, the people shouted, "Merdeka!" freedom. The sound rolled through the city like thunder. But the world was not ready to let the Dutch East Indies go. Far away in Europe, the Netherlands had emerged from its own nightmare of Nazi occupation. Its leaders, desperate to reclaim lost prestige and resources, declared that the Indies would return to Dutch control. The Allies, weary from years of war, reluctantly agreed to let them reoccupy their former colony, at least until order could be restored. What followed was not peace, but another struggle born from the ruins of empire. When British and Dutch forces began landing on Java and Sumatra in late 1945, they expected cooperation. What they found instead was revolution. Armed militias, many of them former laborers and soldiers trained under the Japanese, refused to surrender their weapons. Streets that had once echoed with the march of Japanese troops now erupted with gunfire between Indonesians and returning colonial troops. The war was supposed to be over, but for the people of the Indies, it was only changing names. The city of Surabaya became the crucible of this new conflict. In November 1945, British troops sent to secure the city for the returning Dutch found themselves surrounded by tens of thousands of Indonesian fighters. They wore mismatched uniforms, carried old rifles and stolen grenades, and fought with a fury born of suffering. The British demanded surrender. The Indonesians refused. The battle that followed was fierce and tragic. Street by street, house by house, Surabaya burned. Tanks rolled through neighborhoods. Artillery turned the skyline into smoke and ruin. Thousands died, yet their resistance would become a symbol of defiance, a declaration that Indonesia would never again be ruled by another power. For the Dutch, the return to their East Indies was a bitter illusion. The world that had once obeyed their rule was gone. The plantations were overgrown, the refineries destroyed, the cities filled with armed youth who no longer feared the whip or the flag. The Dutch administrators, who had once governed from verandas under the tropical sun, now found themselves negotiating with revolutionaries who spoke in the language of independence. Between 1946 and 1949, the islands bled once more. Dutch forces launched military offensives, Operation Product, Operation Cry, attempting to reassert control. They recaptured major cities but not hearts. Each victory on paper only deepened the anger on the ground. Guerrilla fighters struck from the hills, sabotaging roads and railways. Dutch soldiers, many just boys who had survived the Nazi occupation, found themselves burning villages in a foreign land. The war that was meant to restore order instead exposed the last breath of colonial power. Meanwhile, across the shattered Pacific, the world was changing. The United States, now the dominant power, saw the winds of decolonization as inevitable. The Cold War had begun, and independence movements were no longer a threat to be crushed, but potential allies to be courted. By 1949, global pressure mounted on the Netherlands to accept reality. Exhausted, bankrupt, and isolated, they finally agreed. On December 27, 1949, in a ceremony witnessed by diplomats and soldiers alike, the Kingdom of the Netherlands formally transferred sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia. It was the final chapter of a struggle that had begun not in politics but in war. The Dutch East Indies, once a jewel of empire, once the battlefield of nations, was no more. But victory carried its own scars. The war had taken millions of lives, Indonesian, Dutch, Japanese, Allied. Cities were in ruins, families scattered, generations scarred by occupation and famine. The oil fields that had once fueled empires now lay silent, their pumps rusting beneath vines and rain. Graves dotted the jungles and beaches, some marked, most forgotten. The Pacific had consumed them all, sailors from the Java Sea, prisoners from Burma, villagers from Sumatra. And yet, amid the wreckage, life began again. Markets reopened, children returned to schools, farmers planted rice where tanks had once sunk into the mud. In villages across Java, old men told stories beneath flickering lamps, stories of the time when the world came to their shores and burned. To the young, it sounded like legend, but to those who had lived it, the memories were carved deep, like scars in the earth. For Japan, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies had seemed a triumph of destiny. In truth, it had been a curse. The oil they sought had fueled not victory, but destruction. By reaching too far, Japan had ignited a war that consumed its own empire. The resources of the Indies, once symbols of power, had turned to ashes long before the final surrender. The price of empire had been paid in the lives of millions, in the loss of honor, and in the collapse of belief itself. For the Netherlands, the war marked the end of an era. The dream of empire had died not with defeat, but with irrelevance. The age of colonies was over. The people they had once ruled now stood as equals in a world rebuilt from the ruins of war. And for Indonesia, born from the wreckage of both empires, independence came at a terrible cost. Freedom was not given. It was taken, torn from the grasp of occupiers by those who had nothing left to lose. The blood spilled in Java's streets, the hunger of the camps, the suffering of the Ramusha, all became part of the nation's soul. The struggle had forged identity from pain and unity from despair. Today, the ghosts of that war still linger. Beneath the tropical canopy, the rusted hulks of ships lie silent in the Java Sea, their decks now coral reefs, where fish drift through portholes that once framed dying men. In Sumatra, the ruins of oil refineries stand half-swallowed by jungle, their twisted metal glowing red under the setting sun. And in the cemeteries, Dutch and Indonesian graves lie side by side, enemies once, now equal beneath the earth. History, in the end, does not forget. It whispers through the waves that crash upon the shores of Borneo, in the wind that moves through Java's highlands, in the silence of those who survived. The war for the Dutch East Indies was not just a struggle for resources or empire, it was a reckoning between ambition and humanity, greed and survival. The fall of the Indies was more than a military defeat. It was the unraveling of an age, the moment when the old world of colonial empires gave way to the new world of nations. It showed that the mightiest armadas and the proudest flags could vanish, but the human will to endure could not. As the camera of history fades on the islands of the East, the echoes remain, the thunder of guns over Java, the roar of burning oil, the cries of freedom rising from the smoke. The empire that came for oil left behind a nation, scarred yet unbroken. In the end, the Dutch East Indies was not lost to Japan nor reclaimed by the Netherlands. It was reborn as Indonesia, a land once fought over by empires now standing on its own. And so, from the ashes of conquest and the shadow of war, the final truth emerges: empires fall, but freedom endures. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.